All right, hello everyone. Welcome back to CHRTC 309. So this is Sociology of Youth and Religion. Okay, so in the next few lectures here, I'm going to basically be going over some of the sort of basics of sociology of religion. Some of the big theories, which we'll come back to, right? They're going to appear on quizzes and exams. And basically, we're going to talk about these kind of on an ongoing basis throughout the course, trying to figure out, what makes sense of our experience today of youth and religion. Now, if you've taken, one of many courses with me, Sociology 376, which is Sociology of Religion, or CHRTC 203, which is the Sociology of Christianity, a lot of this is going to be really, really familiar to you because they are the same theories. But because I don't know who's taking these courses, right, there's no prerequisite. It's something we just kind of have to go over once again. And if you're new to the topic of sociology of religion, right, you haven't taken anything with me, then yeah, these are all going to be quite new for you. So for those of you who've seen it before, do please bear with me. Move at a slightly faster speed if that's what you need to do. And for those of you for who it's new, obviously, these are at times some challenging concepts. We're going to go right back to sort of the beginnings of sociology of religion with Durkheim, Marx, and Weber, and then kind of move forward into some more contemporary theories, through the 20th century and then into the end of the 20th century with someone like Christian Smith. Okay, so one of the terms that we're probably going to bandy about here fairly frequently is modernity, right? And modernity and religion have this kind of weird relationship. Really, all of the sociological theories of religion are attempts to understand either, where religion comes from and why societies have kind of religion in general, which it would be the case with a lot of, say, Durkheim, and then how religion's relationship with society changes once we enter the period of modernity. Right? Now, modernity is a fairly loose term at times, simply because there's no like specific start and end date. And at the end of the day, it is the period that we live in now, and it's the period that we've been living in probably for a couple of centuries, right? At least going back to the Industrial Revolution, but probably a little bit earlier than that even, right? Into the kind of colonial era and the era of what Marx would call accumulation, right? Where the colonial empires out of Europe, started traveling to the Americas, collecting resources, which then kind of launched industry and all these sorts of things. Okay, but what do we see, what are the characteristics of modernity, right? So how do we know when we are in modernity? Well, obviously, as you can see on the slide here, right, industrialization is one of the key characteristics. The transformation in how people made things, right, that starts at the end of the 18th century, right, with the Industrial Revolution, first in England, then on both continental Europe, and in the Americas, particularly the United States, and it's sort of slow spread throughout the world after that, right? Now that isn't obviously complete, right? There are places in the world that are not yet industrialized, right? If you look at, sub-Saharan Africa, for the most part, remains non-industrialized in big chunks, right? So it's not a completed process. It's always a kind of ongoing process of modernization or entry into modernity. One of the other key features is urbanization, right? Along with industrialization comes the move to major centers and cities and the real growth of cities, starting with places like London, New York, Paris, Berlin, and then, just larger and larger urban centers forming to accommodate factories and industrialization and housing all of the workers that those things needed. Along with that, but even, this probably slightly predates industrialization and urbanization, is bureaucratization, right? So the creation of these big bureaucratic systems basically to administer industrial systems, right? So industrial society, big and complex, and it needs a skilled trained and specialized group of people to help run it, right? And the bureaucrats, basically bureaucracy is, you know, from the root words, that mean the rule of the desk, right? So this is one of the features of modernity is bureaucracies that rule people's lives, right? That make rules, that organize life, and all these sorts of things. And we encounter them all the time. When you go to register for a course, you're encountering a bureaucracy. When you go to the bank, it's another bureaucracy. When you get your passport, another bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is sort of everywhere. The growth of education, right? More and more universal education, principally because as industry gets more developed, you need more skilled workers to basically make all of that stuff work. So you get the growth of education and the education state. From there, we get social differentiation. As we enter modernity, more and more of the tasks that used to be devolved to religion, and this is one of the things that most theories of secularization, which we'll talk about in a little bit, are going to point to as one of the key markers of secularization, is social differentiation, right? Whereas the religious institutions of a society, right, the church, the mosque, or whatever other religion happens to be, local, used to take on a lot of the tasks like education, healthcare, social welfare, charity, taking care of the poor, all of these sorts of things, orphanages. They were all run essentially by the only kind of big group that was able to be sort of universalizing of the society, which was the religious kind of apparatus, right? In the West, principally, we're talking about the Catholic Church or Protestant churches. In other parts of the world, obviously, you're going to have different kind of religious organizations, right? Mosques, synagogues, temples that take on a lot of this work. As we move into modernity, though, one of the things that we see is that a lot of this splits off of religious organizations, right? It becomes too big and complex for religious organizations to really do. And therefore, what you end up with is the state taking it over. Now, this is relatively recent in a lot of cases, right? If we look at, say, universal education, the education system, if you go back to even just my parents' generation, so when my parents were born in the 40s and 50s, they were principally educated by clergy, right? By nuns and priests in schools run by the Catholic Church in northern Alberta, right? So this is relatively recent, right? So within kind of their lifetime, my dad's mid-70s, my mom just turned 70. We've seen this kind of transformation of the education system. The same thing, right? When my mom was born, it was nuns that were running the hospital where she was born, right? And so this gradually sort of shifted, over that period, through especially the 50s and 60s in Canada to specialized kind of agents, nurses, doctors, running everything, and the church kind of being pushed out of this, right? And this is the case kind of broadly across a bunch of institutions. Religious institutions have become less central to people's lives, right? They now occupy the space of, and again, we'll talk about this when we talk about theories of secularization, they occupy the space of religion, right? Church is church, and the church does church things, and the school does school things for the most part. Catholic schools and Christian schools notwithstanding, the public education system principally does school stuff. The social welfare and childcare system kind of does its thing. And all of these things now are differentiated into their specialized spheres, and religion is no longer kind of the overarching one. Okay. The rise of a scientific worldview. So obviously, and this is kind of an argument that as less so than an established fact, I think in some ways, but science kind of starts to displace religion as a way of explaining the world, right? And Weber points to this, going back into the 18th and 19th century, that you get this scientific revolution, through the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, and religion and its purview sort of retreats a little bit, right? It's no longer where people go to understand the physical world, at least, right? It is now science is given over to understanding the physical world and increasing parts of our kind of reality, right? psychology starts to displace religion in understanding personal struggles and mental illness. And, even in some senses, religion itself becomes sort of psychologized, right? We get the displacement, of a religious view, and, you might, in the extreme, have, say, demons and spirits and these sorts of things being replaced rather by science, right? We're going to talk about mental illness and disorders and all of these sorts of things. These displace kind of religion in general. Okay, rationalism, right? The idea that we need to organize the world in a rational way, right? That the best way to organize a society is the most rational one, the one that's going to create the most efficiency. That's the rise of rationalism. Individualism, right? The growth of, or the movement away rather, from a sort of collectivist view, and Durkheim talks about this a lot. The community, the town, your group, your religion, a movement away from that towards greater and greater individualism. And this really kind of has been going on for a long time, but picks up steam, in the post-World War II period and accelerates forward into kind of Gen Z, right? Gen Z now, I think we can say, is probably the most individualistic generation that we've ever seen. But this has been a kind of gradual increasing of individualism. Some people call it radical individualism, at the expense of the collective or community. Okay, and then the growth of pluralism. You go from societies that were more homogenous, both racially, ethnically, and religiously, right? You lived in a Catholic kind of world, or a Protestant world, or a Muslim world, and increasingly as, we get immigration, the mixing of people in urban centers, you get more pluralism, right? More people from different kinds of worldviews mixing together. And the argument always here is that this is going to undermine religion a little bit, specifically for the reason as, and this, I'll talk about Berger's sacred canopy in a little bit here, but when everybody believes the same thing, it's easy to maintain a structure of belief. The more mixing you have of people with different ideas and different worldviews, the harder it becomes to maintain a particular religious worldview. And then secularism, right? Basically, the growth of basically a worldview that doesn't include religion, and particularly the separation of kind of worldly power and religious power, right? The state and religion being separated from each other in major ways. Those are the key kind of aspects of modernity. All right, so just kind of doubling down on this definition of modernity as something both that kind of pushes religion to the outside and something that really is focused on individualism is this quote from theologian Stanley Hauerwas. So Hauerwas, I really like his definition of modernity because, outside of those aspects I talked about on the last slide, I like kind of what he says here because I think it kind of encapsulates two parts of kind of the project of modernity really, really well, right? So Hauerwas says modernity, sought to secure the knowledge in the structure of human rationality and relegated God to the gaps or denied him altogether, right? Okay, so right away, religion, right, or generally the supernatural, is pushed to the edge or denied altogether, and basically says, and this is a very Marxian kind of way of thinking about it. Marx getting it from people like Feuerbach, saying that God is a projection of the ideals that we want, right? So that basically the idea of God is something that we project onto the universe as human beings as a kind of ideal of what we want to be, right? And again, this comes straight out of Marx. Okay, so that's one part of it, right? God is pushed to the edge, and we start to see God in a psychological way as just an aspect of human society, right? And Durkheim says something similar as well, right? Marx, Durkheim kind of say something similar about God. And then this one, which I think is really interesting in all sorts of ways, and I think really applies to youth very specifically, right? Because I think as we move through from the baby boomers in the 40s, 50s, and forward, the Generation X, millennials, and then Gen Z, we see this more and more coming to fruition, right? That modernity names a time when you produce people who believe they should have no story, except the story they chose when they had no story. That's called freedom. If you were determined by a story you didn't choose, you're not beholden to it. So this is, this aspect of modernity that I think is really interesting. You might call it radical individualism, but whatever you want to call it, right? Modernity breaks down traditions, right? It breaks down the things that bound people into communities, right? So like in the past, kind of what Harwas is getting at here is you had a story, right? Before you chose a story, before you chose who you were defined by the community you were born into, right? You were born into a Roman Catholic family, so you were a Roman Catholic. And there were real consequences should you choose to abandon that story, right? You would be ostracized from your friends, your family, your community. All of that stuff could be taken away from you. So, you had a story that you had when you had no story. But what modernity has said is that you shouldn't be beholden to that, right? That you should be the one who chooses your story yourself. So any story that you are born into that you didn't choose, you are not beholden to. Whether it's religion, whether it's gender, right? The idea that we see in the LGBTQ movement of, someone being assigned a gender at birth, right, is very much, this is what Harwas is talking about, right? That modernity says, no, if you were assigned a gender at birth, you're not beholden to that, right? You can choose a different story for yourself. You can choose a different gender, right? You can, some people might dispute the language of choice there a little bit. I don't want to kind of get into that, but that you're not beholden to that story, right? And race and class and all of these things, they have to be chosen by you, right? Or else they're not authentic because you're not free to choose them. So you're not determined by a story you didn't choose. You're not beholden to it. You're not locked into an identity. You get to pick and choose and reject identities as you please. That's modernity for Harwas. And again, when it comes to young people, I think we've seen an increased movement in this direction over time, right? We've become more and more individualistic and more focused on, living your authentic truth or however people want to phrase it, right? It changes a little bit all the time. But this idea that you have to be authentic to yourself and that it's being authentic to yourself isn't, digging deep down into the story of your family or of your nation, right? Or of your ethnicity. It is about discovering whatever you want and putting that together in any way that you feel. That's modernity. That's the kind of people that modernity produces. And obviously, this causes a lot of tension with universalizing systems like religions that say, this is the truth, this is who you are, this is the identity you have. You don't really have a choice in that. So you can see the tension there. And that, in a sense, is what modernity really creates that tension with, especially for young people that are raised in this environment where it's like, discover your own truth, figure out who you are, and then tell us. So Karl Marx, obviously a social critic and theorist from the middle part of the 19th century. Karl Marx isn't principally concerned with religion. Religion actually plays a relatively small part in Marx's overall analysis. He's principally concerned with economics, and particularly the changes brought on by industrialization and the spread of capitalism in European society. Marx is particularly worried about the social stratification that comes, and especially the exploitations of the workers that he calls proletariat by the ruling class, or the people who own the means of production, the bourgeoisie. And Marx basically thinks that capitalism is fundamentally bad for workers. It alienates them from their work. It separates them from the things they made. It breaks down their tasks into these tiny little tasks that are unbearably boring and kind of meaningless. And ultimately, all they do is they go to work for a little bit of money in terms of wages. The factory owners get to profit massively, but at the end of the day, basically the workers get nothing, and their living conditions are terrible. Basically, what Marx sees in this society is that, the ruling class,
the people who own the means of production, the bourgeoisie, get to propagate their values. They get to bring in all the profits and convince everyone that this is the right way of life. And he fundamentally kind of indicts religion in his work for supporting this mission overall, right? He thinks that religion basically supports the bourgeoisie in the contemporary period as it had supported, say, the feudal lords in the medieval period, right? And the Roman elites versus the slaves in antiquity. Now, Marx, in a lot of ways, isn't a terribly good historian. Um, so he gets a lot of things wrong, but this is his basic critique of religion. Now, religion here, I mean, he principally means Christianity. Marx isn't really dealing with any other religions, and he doesn't really make distinctions between one religion and another. One of the things that we get from Marx, though, is a school of thought called deprivation theory. And basically, deprivation theory suggests that the whole reason that people turn to religion is fundamentally to make up for the deficiencies in their kind of conditions of life as they're living it, right? So for Marx, most people are living in utterly intolerable conditions of poverty, of deprivation, right? They lack material things. They're probably not going to live that long. And religion comes in to offer them the promise of a beautiful afterlife, so that at least, you know that you're not having a great life now, but you can hope for a great afterlife. And fundamentally, what he thinks is that this keeps the population kind of placid and docile, right? He calls religion the opium of the people, or the opium of the masses. And basically, I have the quote up on the slide there. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of a soulless condition. It is the opium of the people. And by this he means, like opium, kind of makes you dopey. Religion, he thinks, kind of makes people not see their real social conditions. They're hoping for better things in the life to come, so they never rise up and, basically overthrow the system. They just kind of tolerate it with hope of an afterlife. And I mean, there is definitely something to Marx's analysis. There certainly have been times, and there are certainly conditions in which religion, and certain forms of religion in particular, do kind of leave people potentially to support conditions they might not otherwise support. And this is, still the kind of Marxist analysis when it comes to religion. Now, that said, Marx also, because he's, I think, overly broad in his analysis, gets a lot of things wrong. And one of the things that Marx just takes no account of, and Marxists have tended to ignore broadly even into the present, is the ways that religion often inspires people to protest inequalities, and that these often come from below and from the oppressed classes, who actually use religion as a as a tool to fight their own oppression. And here you can think of the example of the African American civil rights movement in the United States, where someone like Martin Luther King uses explicitly the language of Christianity. And if you listen to, say, the I Have a Dream speech, it is loaded with the language of Christianity, and basically uses the language of Christianity in order to, basically fight back against their oppressors, and in some cases convince their oppressors that what they're doing is intolerable, that it actually violates the very religious principles that their, upper class oppressors actually pretend, at least, or say that they hold to, right? So the dignity of every human person was violated by, the oppressive Jim Crow laws in the South. And one of the successes of, say, the civil rights movement was pointing that out and using that religious language to convince people of that. The African American churches also were critical in organizing people, organizing protests, organizing all, things like the bus boycotts in Montgomery, the lunch counter sit-ins, and all of these things. These were all coordinated through the African American church. So in this case, religion actually really was, a factor in social change. You can look at also the end of the transatlantic slave trade and the end of American slavery, which again, in a lot of ways, if you look at the kind of accounts of the people who were talking about liberating the slaves, it's for the most part in explicitly Christian language. So, one of the things that Marx doesn't see, and Marxists, in a lot of ways, don't see to this day is the emancipatory potential of religion. That it's not always just about making up for deprivation, but actually sometimes spurs people to action and spurs people to change. And so it's that other side of the coin of religion that I think Marxist scholars don't see. Now, Marx, like most of the other major figures at the beginning of sociology, basically doesn't really see a whole lot of value in religion, and broadly he thinks that modernity would cause religion to fade away, right? Religion would go away, as basically the socialist and then communist eras of human history came into place. Economic oppression disappeared. That deprivation that people were living through was destroyed along with capitalism, and communism brought everyone into a utopia. Basically, Marx thought that religion would have no place, right? People would no longer need it, and it would just disappear. And this is, partially what's called the secularization thesis, and we'll talk in great detail about that in coming lectures. But basically, for Marx, religion is on the way out because it's oppressive, and the era of oppression is coming to an end. Once the revolution, comes about. Of the major sociological figures from the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, probably I think the most insightful in terms of religion was Emil Durkheim. Right? Emil Durkheim writes his Elementary Forms of Religious Life in 1912, and this should give you a sense, I think, of how relatively recent the field of sociology of religion is. Right? It's just a little bit over 100 years old at this point, and really, like, as a major field, this Durkheim's work is probably the first really important one. So basically, Durkheim, kind of trying to figure out the role of religion, in social life, does a whole bunch of stuff. This book, Elementary Forms of Religious Life, he takes a bunch of ethnographic data about the Arunta people in Australia. Now, one of the critiques of Durkheim is that, in his look at religion in this book, he doesn't actually go off and do any of the research himself. He doesn't, kind of go and observe any religious people. He actually just takes these accounts of the Arunta people and makes a bunch of, someone else's research and makes a bunch of broad claims off of it about the role in society of religious belief and ritual. Okay. But when it comes to religion, Durkheim broadly sees it as an inherently social activity, something that binds both people and societies together. And it is important in the creation of the social order, of the way that societies kind of run. So it helps them, have socially agreed upon values and norms, right? The religion is a sort of collection of the values and norms of a particular community that allows them to kind of speak the same language, know what is allowed and not allowed. It ritualizes their experiences and reaffirms the norms that religion sort of offers in kind of routinized, ritualized experiences that create what he calls collective effervescence. So everybody gets together right at a religious ceremony. They go through the motions. They all get a nice feeling of a kind of unity and that God is working or some such thing. A heightened mood. That people get when like-minded people gather, right? And basically it bonds the community together. They feel morally strengthened. It makes their group solidarity stronger. And it is, for him, not a product of a supernatural power, right? So like religious believers, obviously, potentially say Pentecostals would think that their feelings they're having of elation after, a religious service would be because of the Holy Spirit. Not so for Durkheim. Durkheim just views this as the product of, a psychological state. There's no supernatural powers behind it. And for Durkheim, fundamentally, all aspects of religion are products of society, right? These are things that have been created by societies for purposes of keeping that society going. They all serve a function. They're kind of important within that society. And for that reason, Durkheim and his school of thought are referred to as functionalism, right? Religion and all kind of social things have particular functions. And one of the functions of religion is just to bind the society together. So Durkheim, like Marx, thought that at the end of the day, religion was in retreat. That under the onslaught of modernity, of modern ways of thinking, of science, the retreat of supernaturalisms of all kind, that at the end of the day, religion was, inexorably going to disappear. That it was in its kind of death stages, at the beginning of the 20th century. And what Durkheim predicts is somewhat different than what Marx predicts. But he says that basically what ends up happening is, as religion retreats, as those elements, right, that offer broad social norms, broad social values that are accepted by everyone, as religion fades away and that kind of bonding function of religion disappears, what's left, he thought, was the cult of the individual, and a sort of, almost Nietzschean sense of an Übermensch, right, where everybody sets their own path, their own kind of morality, their own belief system, that there are no more binding norms once religion is gone. So what he says, basically is that this is part of a much bigger process that's been going on, really since the Renaissance, the end of the Middle Ages. He looks at medieval society, and what he sees is, broadly societies that were oriented towards the collective, right? The survival of the village, the survival of the society, where everybody has to band together, right? Everybody has to work towards the common good, and therefore religion plays an important role in creating accepted norms and values that everybody follows. This, though, he thinks is disrupted by modernity, and particularly by the rise of capitalism. Capitalism atomizes societies, right? It splits people off from each other. It makes people not see how the whole of society fits together. All they see is the little space that they're in. An idea he calls anomie, right? That people who are anomic don't see where they fit into the norms of society. People for Durkheim, and I think there's a profound truth here, started to see themselves at the beginning of modernity, with the rise of capitalism, as individuals, less as part of the whole, more as autonomous, kind of atomistic, split off from the rest of society. And of course, this is both for good and bad, right? Individualism obviously has certain benefits. For Durkheim, it also has a huge kind of social cost. Ultimately, what Durkheim sees at the end of the day is, people who are sort of left to fend for themselves, who have no, in a sense, deeper social ties, who are cut off from the traditions that should be supporting them at the end of the day. Basically, Durkheim sort of sees, a new kind of morality having become up from this, right? That dignity and rights of the individual would be a necessary replacement, typically enforced by the state, and the state would play a much bigger role. Because for him, if individualism ultimately is left unchecked, the whole society will start to break apart, right? You can't have a society that has no sense of the common good for Durkheim. Otherwise, the society will kind of just shake itself to bits. So Max Weber is the other major founder of kind of sociology and sociology of religion as particular schools. And Weber is very famous for one particular book called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Now, one of the things that's really interesting about the Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism is broadly the fact that, Weber, as opposed to Marx, and in a sense repudiating Marx, who had come before him, sees religion very much as something that can contribute to social change. And in the Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, basically he connects the rise of capitalism, particularly in Northern European states like the Netherlands and England, to the religious ideas held by people in those places, which he contrasts to sort of the slower growth of capitalism in places like France and Italy. And basically, what Weber will make the case for in the Protestant Ethic is the idea that, the need to, kind of assure themselves of salvation through proving that they're blessed by God through becoming rich and industrious and using their resources well, ultimately led, these Protestant countries in Northern Europe to, embrace capitalism and to become the seedbeds of capitalism. On the next slide here, actually, I do have a little video that does a nice little job of explaining like the basics of Weber's theory of the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism.
Those who pursue religion often turn away from worldly affairs. They're suspicious of wealth and business, preferring an ascetic life of contemplation and prayer. The sociologist and economist Max Weber argued that after the Reformation, one form of Christian Protestantism, Calvinism, encouraged a different attitude to work, with far-reaching effects. Calvinists believed in predestination. A precise number of souls would go to heaven. The lucky ones had places reserved by God. However, most Calvinists were terrified there would be no seat awaiting them in paradise. They were always on the lookout for signs that they had been saved. One clear indication that they were on the guest list was that they were actively contributing to their community through their work. In his book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, Weber argued that the Calvinists' need to reassure themselves through their industry was an important factor in the growth of capitalism in Northern Europe. They built up businesses that generated wealth, but at the same time lived thrifty lives. They reinvested any surplus and so helped fuel capitalism. Eventually, capitalism would have a life and momentum of its own. But according to Weber at least, its initial impetus came from a theological source.